Well, it's Mother's Day, and so we had two options. We could either have a completely separate standalone message just for Mother's Day, or we could find something in 1 Corinthians that we're studying anyway, and see if we could tie it into Mother's Day and force the issue. Just continue through 1 Corinthians and not make it work at all, or actually find something that might fit. And I think, since we're in 1 Corinthians anyway, I found something that actually does fit, and you might be surprised at how it fits, because we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 this morning, and we'll be in verses 2 through 16. Now, this passage is notoriously difficult, okay? And in my opinion anyway, I think it's been misunderstood and misused to actually push women down, to hold women back in a way that I don't think Paul intended, and I don't think God intended. I think it actually celebrates men and women, and I think it's actually perfect for Mother's Day because of what's in the text here and how we are able to celebrate our gender differences. You'll notice that if you've got your app or your Bible there, that the heading right above verse 2 says women's head coverings, and that seems to be the focus, right? Everybody wants to jump straight to women's head coverings in this passage, but I think there's a whole lot more there. I think that actually misses the big point, and the point is that Paul wanted to foster unity within the congregation in Corinth, and this was another one of those areas where there was disunity, where there were factions, where there were people arguing for their own rights and their own liberties and all of these things. And I think that's what Paul was talking about. And what we have to understand is that Paul was writing to a congregation that was multicultural. Okay, there was a Roman culture, there was Greek culture, and there was Jewish culture, all represented in this church family, in this body. And these three cultures sometimes overlapped, sometimes clashed, and sometimes two would be pitted against one, and like that, and all three of them would be arguing. And because all three of these cultures were in here, what we're going to find is that Paul does not take nearly as hard of a stance as we sometimes think he does, and I'll show you that in just a second. Okay, I don't think that Paul was meaning or intended to assert a specific hair length or hairstyle or head covering or something. Okay, I don't think that's what his point was. I think that was an issue in Corinth, and that's what he was, as he addressed that, he meant to do a bigger thing, right? I think he meant to do a bigger point. Yeah, I hope so. Are we okay? I'm hoping I can get my slides up there. All right. Good. So, I'll show you what I think the big picture is. There we go. Show you what I think the big picture is. And then we'll work through the text, right, to see it. And then you can make your determination of whether you think I'm right, whether you think I'm wrong, whether you think I've missed it altogether, whatever. I assume there's probably going to be some pushback from someone somewhere along the lines, and that's perfectly fine. I always welcome that. If you have questions, you have concerns, feel free to contact me, and we can wrestle through this together. That's always the case, not just in difficult passages, but always the case. It seems to show up a lot in difficult passages. So, here is what I think Paul's big concern is. And, the four major themes, I think this is unity. Okay, this is the theme. So Paul's concern, and I took this as a quote from, because I think it just summed it up really well from one commentary that I looked at. Paul's concern is not with subordination, although he will talk about that, but with gender distinction. I think that's the big key, is the gender distinction here. This passage is not simply about the head covering of women, like our study Bibles like to pretend it is, and I'll show you why I think that is true in just a second, but about men and women. freedom and respect for the otherness of the others in public worship. Okay? That's what I think we're talking about here. And we can see that with there's a couple of keys that we see as we're working through here. First of all, in the Greek language, there are a couple of terms that are usually translated man. Okay, one of them is anthropos, where we get our word anthropology. Okay, it just means generic person. It can mean a man, a woman, a person, people, whatever. But there is a very specific word for male, man, husband. Okay, and that is the term that's used throughout this section. In fact, interestingly, we'll be in chapter 7 here in a couple of weeks, and that's the word that's used exclusively throughout the chapter 7 on marriage, too. Okay? Is specifically this word for man or husband. And so what we have to determine is he talking about men, like males generically, or is he talking about the context of husband and wife? Chapter 7 is pretty obvious because the whole context is marriage. This one is a little bit trickier. I happen to think in most of these contexts, he's talking about marriage, so husband and wife. So I would translate this husband in most cases, if not all the cases in this passage. Now, there is no distinct word for woman and wife. Okay, anthropos is good for man or woman generically, person, but the same word is for female and for wife, sort of like male and husband. So we need, again, is he talking about women in general? All women? Is he talking about wives and husbands? That's what we need to work through, okay? And it's just part of our Bible study. Another key to this is the Greek word for head, which is pronounced kephale, but when we bring it into English with a C, you can see it's cephala, where we get our word like encephalitis, okay, that disease encephalitis, which has to do with the brain, right? Because en means in, cephale or kephale means head. So in the head, encephalitis is a disease in the head. That's all it means. Okay, we just stole it from another language. It's not even English. Okay, well, this word shows up a lot, and I think it refers both to physical heads, and figurative or spiritual heads. And I think verse 3, which is our memory verse today, sets that out. Sort of a long introduction, but we have to understand where he's coming from. So let's go to we're starting in verse 2. It seems weird to start chapter 11, verse 2, but verse 1, actually, it's one of those areas. You see this a couple of different times where, chapter and verse divisions are not inspired for the most part. Okay, the Psalms are like distinct, so you could say that. But in most cases, chapter and verse divisions are not inspired. They were brought along later based on somebody's opinion. And sometimes they're really, really good, and sometimes they're just not. And I think this is one of those cases where it's like, why would you not put chapter 11, verse 1 at the end of chapter 10? Okay, and so when we do chapter 10, will include through 11:1. So that's why we're starting here. So let me just read straight through the passage. We'll be in chapter 11, verses 2 through 16, and then we'll come back and work through it. Paul wrote this to the believers in Corinth. I praise you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions just as I passed them on to you. But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with his head covered disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered disgraces her head, for it is one and the same thing as having a shaved head. For if a woman will not cover her head, she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. For a man should not have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of the man. For the man did not come from the woman, but woman from the man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for man. For this reason, a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. In any case, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman. But all things come from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But a woman If a woman has long hair, it's her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone intends to quarrel about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. Well, I think that's just pretty self-explanatory, and we'll leave it there. And yeah. Okay. See, you can see this is why it takes a little bit of work, right? So, all right. So, in verse 2, what I want you to notice here, and you see these in the highlights, in verses 2 and 13 and 16. Look at the terminology that I've got highlighted here. Look at verse 2. I say traditions is highlighted. In verse 13, judge for yourselves. Is it proper? Verse 16, practice, or maybe your translation says custom. You notice that there's also a lot of ifs in here. You'll notice that, do you see any command language? Does he talk about teachings or instructions? Is he talking about this is what you have to do? That language is very, let's say it's conspicuously absent from this passage, okay? So that's the first thing. He's talking about traditions, which are not bad things. In fact, he's talking about the traditions that I passed on to you, that Paul himself brought with him to Corinth, taught them, but because he does not specify in this letter which traditions those are, or at least, not in an enumerated way, it's hard to say whether these are scriptural, or whether they're cultural, or whether they're just sort of general, okay? And we today, 2,000 years later, have to stick with what the Scripture says, right? I don't know what was going through Paul's mind if he didn't write it down. And I have no idea what he taught them for 18 months unless he wrote it down and said, this is what I taught you. And so the language that he used in this passage is very important. So there's a vast difference between a tradition and a command or an instruction. And I think what he's trying to do is foster unity in these things. Remember, there's at least 3 different cultures going on here. So, verse 3, and this is actually going to be our memory verse, our key verse this week, because this is where he is now going to define his terms that set up the whole section. Okay? And here are his terms. I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man. Man is the head of a woman. Now, if we stop right there, I do this in marriage counseling and pre-marriage counseling. If we were to stop right there, Christ is the head of every man, and man is the head of a woman, what does that sound like? What is that? Where do people tend to take this? Those of you who are in the room. There's a hierarchy, okay? If you take it too far, though, there are people who look at this and say that there's an inferiority, superiority thing, right? Okay. If all we had was the second phrase that man is the head of a woman, we could say, okay, maybe that's hierarchy, maybe it's superiority, inferiority. When you couple that with the first one, Christ is the head of every man, well, that's definitely a superior thing, isn't it? Christ is superior to people. And that means, if we follow the parallels, that men are superior to women. That's what it looks like. That's at least how some people take it. But what's the third phrase say? That God is the head of Christ. Now, here's a theological issue. Is God superior to Christ? Let's flip it around. Is Christ inferior in any way to God? He is God. He is God. He's not the Father, but he is 100% equal. We say co-equal in all essence and nature and everything. He's 100% God. And so if this were an issue of superiority, now we have to rethink our Christology. We have to rethink our theology about God as far as, is Jesus fully God, or is he inferior in some way to God the Father? Okay? This is one of the reasons why we have to be very careful of trying to build entire doctrines off of one verse. Okay? And one verse out of its context, and one verse with, potentially different understandings here. If we work from the top, or if we work from the beginning of the verse down, it starts to look like we're talking about superiority, inferiority. If we start from the bottom of the verse, the end of the verse, and work up, we find out that the parallel doesn't fit that way because Christ is not inferior to God the Father. What he is subject or subordinate when it comes to his role. And I think that's why the word Christ is used specifically. Because the Christ, the Messiah, is the one who was appointed by God to do a specific thing. And the Father did appoint Christ, Messiah. And so there's a difference in roles, there's a difference in subordination when it comes to function, but we're not talking about value, we're not talking about worth, we're not talking about superior and inferior, we're talking about difference in roles. Okay? And if that's true in the third parallel, or the third section, for the parallel to hold true, that is also in the first section, Christ is the head of every man. Now, it's true that we are inferior to Christ, okay? That's absolutely true, but we have to go outside of this verse to find that. Here we're talking about there's a different role. Christ had a role, and we have a role. And in the context, which we see is the context of worship, Christ's role in our worship to God is as mediator. We're not mediators, we're the worshipers. Christ stands between us and God and mediates. That's his role in this context. So if we can find a role-based or function-based in the third section, and we can find a role or a function in the first section, we can also find a role or a function in the second section. It doesn't say that men are superior to women. It doesn't say that women are inferior to men. It says that we have different roles, and that there is a hierarchy and there is subjection and submission and things that go on, but not based on worth and value, but based on function. And that is the thing that is going to define how he's using the term head throughout this section. I know I'm spending extra time on this because I think this is a big deal to make sure that we have our terms set up right so that we know what we're talking about here, okay? So we cannot disconnect this verse from what follows. In fact, it has to drive what follows, all right? It's okay to be different because differences are not always about weakness. Many times differences are about strengths. And that, I think, is what's going on in this passage here. So, in verse 4 and then the first part of 5, we find, in fact, if I were to just scroll this just a little bit back, you'll notice again, even in the Net Bible, the heading is women's head coverings, right? And that's where everybody wants to jump. But look at verse 4. Who does Paul talk about first in verse 4? Men. Why doesn't the heading say men's head coverings? Why doesn't the headings just say everybody's head coverings? He doesn't jump to women first. He doesn't talk about women exclusively. He's talking about this whole package, okay? And so this is one of those good reasons to not implicitly trust your study Bible notes. Not implicitly trust your study Bible headings. If the chapter and verse divisions are not inspired, the notes and the headings definitely are not inspired, right? Those are opinion, and somebody may do a really good job on that. All of your commentaries are opinion, well studied, well thought out, but still opinion. Okay, and this is why we have to learn how to study the Bible ourselves and do it well and handle it very carefully. So, verse 4 and the first half of verse 5, any man who prays or prophesies with his head covered disgraces his head. Any woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered disgraces her head. Now, this is interesting. Okay, now we're getting into a cultural thing because, again, we have three cultures. We have Roman, we have Greek, and we have Jewish. In the first century, I did a ton of background reading on this, and it was fascinating. Okay, I'll let you borrow the books if you're interested. In the first century, the Roman culture, they would make sure that they covered the men and the women both, or sorry, the men only. The men would make sure that they were covered when they worshiped their gods. Okay, and the women were uncovered. And when they were, say, mourning or grieving, it swapped the other way around. Okay? In the Greek culture, there was no covering at all. Men and women stayed bareheaded. In the Jewish culture, the men were uncovered and the women were covered in worship, and then swapped the other way around in grieving and mourning and stuff. And so we've got all three of these things that are clashing, overlapping a little bit, clashing in some areas, and they're in one congregation like this, trying theoretically to get along. But as we have seen every week in 1 Corinthians, they have found something new to fight about, right? They've got their factions, they've got their clashes. This may be why they chose the particular apostles that they did, because of the backgrounds. I'm of Peter, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. We have three completely different backgrounds for those three guys. And it may be that some of these factions were due to their cultural differences as well. And Paul is saying, listen, any man who prays or prophesies with his head, I think that's his physical head, uncovered, disgraces his head. I would capitalize that H to refer back to verse 3. Uncovered disgraces his head. Who's the head of man? Christ. Okay, in the context. And then the woman prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, disgraces her head. Who's her head? The man. Or, if we look at this in marriage context, we have husband and wife. Okay? Now, I know we're getting technical a little bit here. We're starting to play with words, and you're like, that's not how I read it. Okay, that's fine. We'll talk about that. We can wrestle through it. But can we at least agree on this? What is the context in which he is talking about heads covered and uncovered? Okay, there's traditions, but there's a very specific, I'm going to say, time and place. What is he talking about? When is he talking about this happening? When praying or prophesying publicly. Okay? We're talking about, number one, we're talking about worship gatherings, call them church services, worship gatherings, whatever you want to talk about. And we're talking about when somebody is praying or leading in prayer, and when somebody's prophesying. That's the context. This is not talking about all men and women all the time. This is not talking about all men and women, even everybody involved in a church service. This is talking about those who are leading at this specific area at the specific time. Now, that narrows it down quite a bit, doesn't it? Okay, first of all, let me cut it in half. It's already narrow. Let me cut it in half. There is no new prophecy today. There are no prophets today. There is nobody prophesying today. So the one, if we're going to take this literally in its context, historical context, grammatical context, there is one event or time that Paul specifically mentioned that applies even to today after all the prophets are gone. And that is when a person is leading the congregation in prayer. That's it. Okay? So for those who say, oh, this has to be all the time, he doesn't say that. In fact, he specifically says when you're doing these two things. Okay, now we'll get to prophecy a little bit later this summer when we get into chapters 12 through 14. Prophecy will be a big part of that, and we'll spend time on our spiritual gifts at that point. But the idea that there is a chain of subjection or a chain of submission when it comes to authority in ministry is what he's talking about here, especially public ministry. And the way we fulfill our roles should reflect well on those who are our authority in ministry, okay? Our spiritual authorities. So for wives, that's their husbands. For men, that is Christ directly as well. And then in the second half of verse 5, running all the way down through verse 9, he actually says, because, okay? He's just going to start rolling out these thoughts as to why this applies the way that it does, okay? 5 explanatory proofs for the previous statement. And here's what he says. It's because it's one and the same thing as having a shaved head. What's a shaved head have to do with anything? Evan, I don't know, Oh, you're safe there. It's okay. Because in Roman culture, all right, if a woman was convicted of adultery, they would shave her head so that she looked like, many slaves had shaved heads, and so now she looked like a slave. She did not look like a married woman or a free woman. It was a shame both to her and to her husband. Okay, first century Judaism, they did the same thing, because in the Old Testament law, adulterer and adulteress, man and woman, were both supposed to be executed for adultery. But when, first of all, the law, they stopped doing that when Roman occupation came into the land. Okay, they were not allowed to do a death penalty in most instances, and so they did other things instead, and one of those things was to shave her head. And so Paul could be talking to either the Roman or the Jewish culture here and say, do you really not care what you present like? Do you really not care what you look like when you're up there? You're standing up in the middle of the congregation, you're up in front, and you're leading worship in these areas in prayer and prophesying. Do you not care what you look like? Do you not care how you're presenting yourself? If you don't care, there might be a little bit of sarcasm in here. Why don't you just shave it all off if you don't care anyway? We should care how we present ourselves because of how it reflects on other people. We should care, as we'll see, because we have other people watching. And he says, you might as well just shave it off. It doesn't matter. Okay? In verse 6, the same thing. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut, and I think that is a big if. In our culture, it's not. It's not a problem for most people. Some people, it's true, say, you know what, I think women should have long hair and men should have short hair. All right, let's define those terms. Who gets to determine whether something is long and short? Okay? Our hairstylists get to that's right. That's right. I want my hair short. What does that even mean? Okay, don't cut it off because I want to keep it long. What does that mean? Who gets to determine that? Some people are going to jump down to verse 14 and say, well, nature does. I'll talk about that in a second. What does nature mean when it does that? A lot of this is driven by our culture, the environment in which we grew up. As I go to different places around the world, I find surprise that not every culture is exactly the same that I grew up with. All over the world, there's various cultures, and they fit perfectly in their culture, and it would be very, very strange in our culture. And I take my culture to different places, and they think I'm very, very strange. Okay? And it's just because of the culture. It's not because of me, right? It's just because when I bring my culture to various places, they think that's very strange. That doesn't fit in our culture here. And they're perfectly happy there, and we're perfectly happy here. And if we tried to put it all together, we would find the exact same problem that Paul was facing here in Corinth. This mash of cultures. Who gets to determine? I think that's one of the reasons why Paul did not list out, okay, here's how long your hair has to be. Here's exactly the style. Some people think this is talking about women putting their hair up versus letting it down versus all sorts of things. We have to understand that Paul did not tell us directly. And because he didn't, we can go all the way back to chapter 4, verse 6, where we want to be careful not to go beyond what is written, right? We're looking for the principles. We're looking for the big teaching in these areas. So he says, if it's a disgrace, and it was for some of them in the church hearing this letter, and it was not for some of them hearing this letter, and for many of us today, it's not as well. A man should not have his head covered, ought not, or should not, because he's in the image and glory of God. This is interesting. He says that man is in the image and glory of God, but notice he says that woman is in the glory of the man, or a wife is in the glory of her husband. Notice he doesn't say that she's in the image of her husband. Who is a woman in the image of? Still God. Men and women, male and female. We take that all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. Male and female are both the image of God. We're not talking about superior and inferior. Now, had he said, man is in the image of God and woman is in the image of man, now we could start possibly talking about superior and inferior. He didn't say that. He's talking about glory, and glory has to do with reflection. Reflection from and reflection on. Okay? Men and women both are in the image of God. Husbands and wives are in the image of God. But we do reflect on Christ and each other differently because of our gender distinctions. And some people want to completely cut that out altogether. No gender distinctions. Everything has to be uniform. Everything has to be unisex. Everything has to be the same. And I think that's what one of the things that Paul was fighting against here in 1 Corinthians. We don't want everything to be the same. We want to celebrate what God created. We want to celebrate our gender distinctions. We want to present ourselves in such a way that men are like men and women are like women. We want to celebrate, especially when Christians gather together to worship God. We want to celebrate the distinctions that God himself came up with. In verses 8 and 9, he goes back to creation. And he says that man didn't come from woman, but woman came from man. And this is why the reflection, the glory aspect. And neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. We can go back, and it's not good for a man to be alone. Therefore, God said, I'm going to create someone to help him so that they can move forward and do this together. Woman was not created first, and then man came along later. It was the other way around, and God did that intentionally. And when we get to heaven, you can ask him why. But that's the way it is. And because of that, we reflect God differently. We reflect Christ differently, and we reflect each other differently. How we present ourselves, the way we choose to present ourselves, especially in worship, when we're gathering in the name of Christ to worship him, to worship the Father, how we present ourselves, especially in worship, can either point to God or distract from him, right? We can either help people look at God, because remember, he's talking about people who are leading in areas, right? Leading the group in praying and prophesying. And especially if you think from, I'm going to use this word very generically, a charismatic standpoint, okay? Because the gift of prophecy, if somebody's prophesying, it's spontaneous, but a direct message from God that he wants to put out. It's very easy to get wild, and we've seen some places where people get wild and disheveled and everything. I think Paul is looking for a little bit of decorum and a little bit of propriety as we are worshiping God. It's very easy, whether it's teachers or singers or drama or musicians or whatever, whoever happens to have the spotlight on them at the time, whoever happens to have the camera on them at the time, to grab the attention away from God. And I think that's what Paul has as a part of his thinking here. We want to present ourselves, especially those who are up front. We want to present ourselves in such a way that we're not distracting from who we have come to worship. It's not the people on the platform. It's not the person who has the microphone. I joke about that sometimes, right? I've got the mic, so I can do anything I want. That's a joke. Okay? We are here for one reason and one reason only, and that is to worship the Savior. That is to worship God the Father. And we so easily, when we hold the microphone, when we're on the camera, when we're on the platform, can, as leaders, we can think, oh yeah, it's about me. I need to make sure that I'm presenting myself because people are looking at me. And that's true to a point, but we never want to get to that point where we are forgetting why we're here to begin with. And for those who are not up front, for those who are not leading, we want to make sure that our attitudes are proper as well, that we're not just here for a show. We're not just here because our favorite teacher, our favorite speaker, or our favorite musician, or whatever is going on. We want to make sure that our attitudes are right, that we're not letting ourselves get sucked into somebody else's thing, but we're here for God. And the way we present ourselves as leaders and the way we respond as those who are not leading, I think, is very, very important. And just because of the nature of things, it's not because we're picking on women or anything, but just because of the nature of things and sexual differences and gender differences, women can sometimes attract attention in ways that they don't even want or they don't even intend, right? And that is a reflection on their husbands as well. And so that's just a part of the mix. And I think Paul just included that as a part of the mix. On the previous slide, I had Proverbs chapter 12, verse 4, and I just want to read that. A noble wife is the crown of her husband. Isn't that awesome? Is that a great connection to the glory of her husband? A noble wife helps her husband look good. And a noble husband, by the way, the opposite is true as well. A noble husband helps his wife shine. Okay, and we want to celebrate those things. A noble wife is the crown of her husband, of course, in true Proverbs a pattern. But the wife who acts shamefully is like rottenness in his bones. Okay, so how we present ourselves can reflect not only on God, but can reflect on our spouse as well. And we want to be careful of that, especially those who are leading. All right? So, verse 10, a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Well, that's a fun one right there, isn't it? Anybody want to tackle this one for us? Yeah, she should wear a halo. That's exactly what it. The problem has to do with the word authority. If you were to look in your translations, and I know we've got different translations, people are represented. You got your favorite Bibles. You're going to have authority, power, sign of authority, sign of power. At least those four, plus some other things. Okay. All in your different translations, because even the translators have a hard time understanding what's going on, and the word itself can mean authority or power. Liberty, one translation says a sign of liberty. So you got to be very careful with this. I like the concept of authorization. Okay, the authority is on her head. The covering in this point shows that she has the authorization to be able to do this. She's not just doing this off on her own, whatever. If she's married, she has her husband's support and authorization. And I like how this a woman should wear a covering on her head to show that she has authorization to be able to do this. And I think that's important as we reflect on each other, especially in the culture that Paul was writing to. Now, as far as the angels, all sorts of different opinions on this. I think a natural reading is the best reading. You know that there are angels present right now, right here. They're angels. Okay? And it's very interesting. Obviously, yeah, some of you are like, yeah, of course I am. I'm talking about real angels, good angels, and you can't see them. Okay? You can't see them. But you know what? Angels know what it's like to stand in the presence of God and worship the God of the universe, don't they? They know what true worship is. They know what it's like. We have just a very tiny inkling of what that's. We say we come together and worship. We say that we're worshiping God. The angels are like, you don't even have a clue. You don't have if you were to step into his throne room, you'd be just like everybody else throughout the Bible who saw God. You'd fall flat on your face. From Genesis to Revelation, we find people who see God and fall down as if they were dead because they can't even stand it. And the angels are in here like, you guys don't even have a clue. You don't even know. But it's fun to watch. It's fun to watch you think you're worshiping. It's fun to watch you think that you have proper decorum. It's fun to watch you think that you're doing this right because you don't even have a clue. But we should be cognizant that there are angels watching our worship. Ephesians chapter 3 says that God's multifaceted wisdom, I'll just go here because I want to show you this. Chapter 3, verse 10. The purpose of this enlightenment, the truth of the church, is that through the church, the multifaceted wisdom of God should now be disclosed to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly realms. God is choosing to show off in a good way, right? Show his wisdom, show his glory, show who he is, and he's using the church to do that. Now, whether that's a good move or a bad move, that's up to God, right? But we should do our part to actually show how wise God is in his multifaceted wisdom to those who are watching. And sadly, I think too often we don't give God's wisdom a good reputation to those who are watching. God says, look at what I'm doing down there. And the angels are like, really? That's the best you came up with? Okay, they wouldn't say that to God, but I wonder if maybe, they think that because of how we've got to be cognizant that there are people watching, there are angels watching, and God has designed it that way. 1 Peter 1 says that the prophets did not know all the details of what they prophesied, but angels long to get a glimpse of what's going on. And it's very important that we help them see what God wants us to show them. So, we have to remember that. Verses 11 and 12. In any case, or nevertheless, depending on your translation. And this is where I think it does tie in to Mother's Day and the celebration of gender differences and all that. Nevertheless, he's already said that man was not made for woman, but woman for man, and man didn't come from woman, or because of woman. He didn't say come from. He said man didn't come because of or on account of woman, but woman because of man. Now, notice this, verses 11 and 12. In any case, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. God created us to be interdependent. Okay? A man who says, I don't need a woman, okay? Or especially in the husband-wife relationship, I don't need my wife. I can make all the decisions on my own. I can just do all this stuff myself. I'm going to call him a fool because that's not how God created it. That's not how God has laid it out in Scripture, okay? We're not supposed to be independent, especially in marriage. We're supposed to be dependent and interdependent on each other. But look at verse 12. For just as woman came from man, so also man comes through woman. Right? How? Birth, mother, right? The first woman came out of a man. God took the side of a man, rib, flesh, bone, whatever, and he fashioned a woman. But ever since that point, every man has come from a woman. Every single one. Without women, man cannot come into this world. And Paul says, listen, don't twist my words. Don't make it sound like this is a superiority thing. There's an interdependence. We celebrate the gender differences. We celebrate what God has designed. But there are roles, and there are functions, and there are differences. And differences don't mean weaknesses. Differences mean differences. And we should celebrate those things. And when we gather together, men should be men and women should be women. We shouldn't try to make this uniform. We shouldn't try to make this unisex. We should celebrate. And today, what an awesome day to celebrate mothers. Because every single one of us, man or woman, has come through a woman. If it were not for our mother, we wouldn't be here. Happy Mother's Day from Paul. Right? But all things come from God at the end of verse 12. All things come from God. Let's not forget why we're here. Let's not forget who put this together and why we're doing this. It's not about it is about a hierarchy, but it's not about a value or a worth-based thing. In the last few verses here, verses 13 through 16, as we finish, Paul says, "So judge for yourselves." Okay, you're going to have to come to a decision. You're going to have to come to a unity in your congregation. What is disgraceful? What is not disgraceful? But always be cognizant of those who are watching, those you can see, those you cannot see. And don't forget the outside world is watching as well. How we interact with each other and the unity or the disunity that we have with each other. Everybody is watching. Believers, unbelievers, angels good, angels bad, God himself. So let's be careful how we worship. Let's come with the right attitudes. Let's come with the right decorum and the right propriety. And let us celebrate what God has designed. So judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Doesn't even nature prove that men are supposed to have short hair and women are supposed to have long hair? Doesn't nature say that? Well, it depends on how you define nature, right? Because if you look at just if you look at all the let me put it this way. If you look at what is called nature, right? Let's say you're watching a nature show on TV or on your streaming channel or whatever. What are they going to show you? If it's a nature show, what are they going to show you? Animals primarily, right? And in the animal kingdom, in the animal world, who usually has the longer hair, the most color, the most adornment? The males. Okay? It's the females that have less color. It's the females that are smaller. It's the females that have less hair. It's the females that are sort of, I was going to say bland, but camouflage is is probably better. It's true, yeah, it's true. Because in the animal kingdom, the males have to be bigger and bushier and colorful and everything to attract a mate, right? So if we're going by nature as far as the created order, is it disgraceful or shameful for a male to have longer hair? I don't think so. I don't think so. You say, well, in humans are not animals, which is absolutely true, and so we're supposed to be completely opposite. We're supposed to be completely different. Don't you know that when I look at a man, I'm supposed to see long or short hair, and when I look at a woman, I'm supposed to see longer hair? Maybe in your part of the world, maybe in your generation. One of the things that I think nearly every commentary that I read, every background that I read, said that has generally been the case in a lot of history, a lot of course of history, but that's not always been the case. And every single one of them pointed to the Spartan soldiers, the Spartan army, who it was, I don't know if it was a rule, but it was their culture, their nature, that the Spartan soldiers had shoulder-length hair, every single one of them. So is that long or short? For Evan, it's long, right? It's shorter than his beard, though, right? So, right? It's shorter than if they didn't cut it at all, right? Okay, but if you leave somebody, a man, to not cut his hair, it's going to grow in many cases the same length as a woman's hair, right? If it were a nature thing, if it were a God-designed, ordered thing, don't you think that maybe God would have it stop automatically? If it were nature, if it were a created thing, okay, then we would have something to argue about there. We have to be very careful taking our culture and transferring it, or our preference even, and transferring it to someone else, even in our own world, much less in a world that's 2,000 years or more past. We have to be very careful. So what does it mean when it says, doesn't even nature itself teach you that? Well, I think it has to do with the nature of things in your culture. I think it does have to do with the culture. I think it does have to do with your local preferences and culture. Okay, what is, like I said, what is true in one culture is not going to be true in another culture. And if we try to mandate that, or if they tried to come and mandate to us, we would say, hold on a second, that's not the way it's supposed to be. And they would say, show us chapter and verse. And we would have a hard time doing that because there is no chapter and verse that says things have to be certain covering or a certain length or a certain style. And so we have to be very careful with how we define our terms. We can say, verse 15, that if a woman has long hair, it's for her glory. Is that true? Remember, this is a question. Does nature teach you this, if this is true? Okay. I think the point is that men and women are supposed to be distinct from each other. I think that's the point. We're supposed to celebrate these differences, and however your culture does that, and I've seen cultures where it's just exactly opposite. The women shave their heads and the men let their hair grow long, but there is a distinction. It is a clear difference. They don't blend those two things. They dress and act and wear their hair differently. Am I going to tell them that they're doing that wrong because that's not the culture that I grew up in? I don't think that's right. I don't think that is what Paul is talking about. Cultures and customs change from generation to generation, from continent to continent. Over the years, cultures are going to change, customs are going to change. They're always in flux, even nearby, right? Just even with the people who are watching this online and who are in the room right now, all sorts of different styles and preferences. Is that how God wants us to determine, is based on our preference? I don't think so. I think the big point is he's telling them, don't let this be another thing that drives you to disunity. Judge for yourselves, figure it out, work on a custom that works in your culture at your time that's not going to offend the outside world, but that's also something that you can work with together and be unified in, that still celebrates the design that God made. And when you come together to worship, you can worship him who he made you to be, with all of your idiosyncrasies and all of your customs and all of your cultures and all of the things that make you you, and celebrate his wisdom. I think that's what he's talking about. Now, is it possible that I'm wrong? Absolutely. I think I'm probably not, but you may think differently, and I'd love to hash that out with you. Here are a couple of questions as we finish off, or one question actually with two aspects as we finish this. Verse 16, by the way, says, if anyone intends to quarrel about this, I don't have anything else to say. That's what he says. If anyone wants to argue about this, I don't have any other practice, and neither do the churches of God. So you can argue about it, but I'm not going to argue with you. That's what he's saying. So here's the question. Do you have the right attitude when you come together to worship? And there are two aspects of this. For leaders, are we being careful to point others to God instead of making it all about ourselves? And for those who are not leading at any given time, are we coming with the right attitude to make sure that our focus is on God, who he is, his design, and we celebrate what he's doing, and not about what other people, what people are wearing, what people look like, what people sound like, all of that. We're here as a bunch of different people trying to find unity, and that unity comes from God. All things are from God, even in all of our differences. So celebrate the difference, celebrate the design, but don't let that hold us back from the true worship of God. And don't forget, people and angels are watching. All right? So that's our passage this morning, and I'm going to close in prayer. If you have thoughts and questions and comments, be sure to send those in. You can text, you can use your connection card, you can email, you can call and leave a voice message if, there's a lot of times not somebody here. So, but say, hey, I'd like to wrestle through this a little bit more. I'd like to see a little bit, maybe you're thinking where that came from. That's perfectly fine. And we can do that together. All right? So let's pray, and then we'll be done this morning.